today's video, we examine an Everest climb where a routine decision made near the summit led to an outcome no one expected. A father and son began the final ascent together, but they did not finish it the same way. What followed raised questions that still have no simple answer. It was May 19th, 2016, high on the south side of Mount Everest, near the end of the spring climbing season. Above 27,800 feet, conditions were unusually calm. The winds were light. The sky was clear. Visibility stretched far across the western CWM. These were the kind of conditions climbers wait weeks for, the kind that quietly suggest there's more time than there really is. That morning, two climbers were moving upward through the upper death zone. Marek Nowak, a 52-year-old engineer from Poland, and his son Tomasz Nowak, 23. They were clipped into the same fixed rope system, using bottled oxygen set at similar flow rates. From a distance, they looked like any other father and son team making a summit push. Up close, their reasons for being there were different. For Marek, Everest was unfinished business. He had already climbed two other 8,000-meter peaks and spent years building experience at altitude. But Everest had stopped him twice, once because of high winds and once because delays higher on the route cost him his oxygen margin. By 2016, he knew this was likely his last realistic chance. Recovery took longer than it used to. Cold injuries lingered. Another expedition would be difficult to fund and harder to justify. This climb was planned as a final attempt. Tomasz's goal was simpler. Everest was his first 8,000-meter mountain. He was strong, fit, and well-prepared, but still early in his climbing career. He had grown up climbing with his father in the Tatras and the Alps, and later completed high-altitude trips to Aconcagua and Denali. He had never been above 7,000 meters before this expedition. For him, Everest was a test of strength, endurance, and readiness. Their plan was straightforward: climb together as long as possible, then adjust if needed. Marek handled the planning. He chose the oxygen systems, tracked weather forecasts, and set turnaround times. Tomasz followed those decisions without argument, not because he lacked confidence, but because he trusted his father's experience more than his own judgment at extreme altitude. That trust held through acclimatization. Tomasz adapted well during rotations. He stayed steady, showed no serious altitude symptoms, and kept pace without complaint. To Marek, this confirmed that his son was capable of being there. Their shared goal was framed carefully. If both reached the summit, that was ideal. If only one did, the expedition would still be considered a success. That idea reduced pressure, but it also created an unspoken priority. When a decision had to be made, it would favor the climber most likely to finish. By the time they reached Camp 4, that imbalance was already in place. Above 26,000 feet on Mount Everest, the human body is no longer able to fully adjust to the altitude. Climbers can't get used to it, no matter how fit or experienced they are. Survival in this zone depends on three things: bottled oxygen, how long a person stays exposed, and whether they keep moving. On May 19th, 2016, reports from the South Col showed calm, workable conditions. Temperatures were around -30 to -35 degrees Fahrenheit, with light winds under 15 miles per hour. Visibility was good, and no major storms were expected during the summit window. By Everest standards, this was considered acceptable weather for a summit attempt. But at that height, stable weather doesn't remove the danger. Near 28,000 feet, the amount of oxygen in the air is about a third of what it is at sea level. Even with bottled oxygen, the body is working close to its limits. Muscles tire quickly, blood moves more slowly, and the body struggles to stay warm. At this altitude, staying warm depends heavily on movement. Most body heat comes from muscles doing work. When a climber stops moving, heat production drops fast. The body shifts blood toward the heart and brain, reducing circulation to the hands, feet, and legs. This makes frostbite and hypothermia more likely, even when a climber is wearing full cold weather gear. Bottled oxygen helps with breathing and mental clarity, but it does not keep a person warm. Oxygen systems are set up for climbing, not sitting still for long periods. Medical guidance used on Everest warns that staying in one place for too long, above 27,000 feet, can cause rapid physical decline. Accounts from other Everest climbs show the same pattern. Climbers who stop moving for extended periods at that altitude often lose strength and coordination quickly. Some become unresponsive without any obvious warning signs. In these conditions, Survival depends less on the weather and more on how long a person remains still. Once a climber can no longer move on their own, recovery without immediate help is unlikely, according to expedition records and the surviving climber's later account. Marek and Tomasz Nowak left Camp First shortly before midnight on May 19, 2016, beginning their summit push under stable conditions. Both were using bottled oxygen and were clipped into the fixed rope system installed earlier in the season. The initial hours followed a standard pattern. Movement was slow but continuous. Rest pauses were brief and functional, limited to mask adjustments and short breathing breaks. Tomasz remained upright and responsive, though his pace was measurably slower than during earlier rotations. Marek later described this as consistent with expected fatigue at that altitude. As they climbed higher, the change was gradual, but noticeable. By the time they reached around 27,800 feet, Tomasz was no longer moving with the same rhythm. He told his father his legs felt heavy, like they weren't responding the way they had earlier. Keeping his steps in sync with his breathing was taking more effort. Marek noticed it too. Tomasz took longer to answer simple questions. He paused longer before sliding his ascender up the rope. Still, there were no obvious warning signs. He wasn't collapsing, vomiting, or losing consciousness. From the outside, everything else looked fine. The conditions around them did not give any obvious warning. According to expedition weather logs and radio updates from Camp 4, nothing had changed in the hours leading up to the decision. Wind remained light and steady. Temperatures were cold, but within the expected range for that elevation. Headlamps from other climbers could be seen moving above and below them on the route, indicating that the push was still underway across multiple teams. There were no radio calls advising a retreat and no visible signs, such as rising winds or cloud cover, that suggested an immediate threat. Several climbers who passed through the same section later reported that the route felt slow but stable. No one described the conditions as dangerous enough to stop. This was the kind of moment climbers are trained to manage by pacing and discipline rather than retreat. Just below the summit ridge, Marek stopped and reassessed. Turning around together at that point would have ended the climb. Neither of them would reach the summit, and there would be no second attempt. Oxygen reserves were already being drawn down, and the season was nearing its end. Continuing upward together at Tomasz's pace carried its own risk. Slower movement meant more time exposed in the death zone and a higher chance that both would run low on oxygen before descending. In his later statement to expedition officials, Marek said he did not believe his son was in immediate danger. Tomasz was tired, but still conscious, still communicating, and still clipped securely to the rope. Marek interpreted the symptoms as normal exhaustion near the top, not as the beginning of a medical crisis. Based on his experience, he believed a short rest would allow Tomasz to recover enough to descend safely. With that in mind, Marek gave clear instructions. He told Tomasz to stop climbing and remain where he was. He told him to sit upright, stay clipped into the fixed rope, and keep his oxygen flowing. The plan, as Marek described it later, was to summit quickly and return in about an hour. Tomasz did not argue. According to Marek, he acknowledged the instruction and complied without hesitation. There was no discussion about turning around together, and no sign of panic or distress. Marek clipped his ascender higher on the rope and began moving upward. Before continuing, he looked back. Tomasz was still seated, upright and responsive. His headlamp was on. His oxygen mask was in place. As Marek climbed higher, the route curved, and Tomasz passed out of sight. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw Tomasz alive. Marek reached the summit roughly 90 minutes after leaving Tomasz at the waiting point. According to his later account and timestamps taken from summit photographs, the final stretch took longer than he had planned. The delay was caused by congestion along the summit ridge, where climbers were forced to wait their turn to move past narrow sections of fixed rope. At that height, even short pauses add up. Every stop meant more oxygen consumed and more time spent exposed. Marek later told expedition officials that he was aware the climb was taking longer than expected. He checked his remaining oxygen pressure more than once and adjusted his pace to conserve what he could. At the summit, Marek stayed only long enough to confirm he had reached it. Photographs taken there show no prolonged celebration. He did not remove his gloves or stop for extended rest. His oxygen supply was already low enough that remaining longer would have increased the risk of problems on the descent. Within minutes, he turned around and began moving back down the route. The descent was slow but steady. Going downhill at that altitude still requires effort. careful foot placement, and attention to the fixed lines. Marek later said his focus was on getting back to Tomasz as quickly as possible while staying upright and avoiding a misstep. When he reached the waiting location, Tomasz did not answer when spoken to. Tomasz was still attached to the fixed rope, but his posture had changed. He was no longer sitting alertly. His head was lowered, and he did not react to voice commands. Marek called his name several times and moved closer, expecting at first that Tomasz might simply be asleep or disoriented. There was no response. This was the moment Marek understood that the situation had changed. What happened after Marek climbed out of sight had to be pieced together later. There were no witnesses close enough to watch Tomasz during that time. No one reported a fall. No equipment was found damaged. Weather records showed no sudden change in wind or temperature. From the outside, nothing unusual happened on the mountain. When Marek left him, Tomasz was seated upright, clipped into the fixed rope, breathing bottled oxygen at roughly 3 liters per minute. After the climb, the oxygen system was inspected. The regulator worked. The mask seal was intact. The flow was steady. There was no mechanical failure. The system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. What failed was something less obvious. Once Tomasz stopped moving, his body stopped making heat. At nearly 28,000 feet, even light wind and constant cold pull warmth away faster than the body can replace it without muscle activity. Oxygen kept him conscious for a time, but it did nothing to keep him warm. It could not slow the loss that had already started. As the minutes passed, blood flow shifted inward. Circulation to his hands, feet, and legs dropped as his body tried to protect vital organs. This kind of change is slow and quiet. People don't feel it happening. The first thing usually lost is fine motor control. Simple tasks, tightening a strap, adjusting a mask, standing up, become harder without the person fully realizing why. Accounts from similar incidents show the same pattern. Climbers often feel heavy, tired, and foggy rather than panicked. There is no clear signal that something is seriously wrong. By the time the danger becomes obvious, the body may no longer respond. At some point, Tomasz would have been unable to stand. This does not mean he immediately lost consciousness. Climbers in similar situations have later described being awake, but physically unable to move. There is no evidence that Tomasz tried to descend. When he was later found, his harness and carabiner were positioned correctly, suggesting he remained clipped in the entire time. As his core temperature continued to fall, his thinking would have slowed further. Hypothermia and lack of oxygen worked together, leading to confusion and then loss of consciousness. Oxygen continued to flow, but without movement. It could not reverse what had already started. The failure happened quietly, without warning, and without a moment that looked like an emergency. When Marek reached the spot where he had left his son, the scene was not what he expected. Tomasz was still clipped into the fixed rope. He was upright, but completely still, with his head tilted forward. His body no longer held its own weight the way it had earlier. When Marek touched him, he noticed the suit felt stiff through the layers of insulation. He checked the oxygen mask and saw no fog inside it, no sign of steady breathing. He spoke to Tomasz, first calmly, then louder. There was no response. When he grabbed Tomasz's shoulder and shook him, nothing changed. At that altitude, there were no real options left. Marek did not attempt CPR. Above 27,000 feet, it isn't considered workable. The effort required is more than the body can handle in such thin air. And expedition medical guidelines are clear that trying would only put the rescuer in danger without a realistic chance of success. Marek stayed with his son for a short time. He checked the oxygen system again to make sure it was still flowing. It was. Tomasz did not move. He did not breathe on his own. He did not wake up. Standing still any longer only made the situation worse. Marek's own oxygen supply was dropping, and the cold was beginning to take hold of him as well. There was no way to lower Tomasz safely, no materials to build a shelter, and no way to call for help that could arrive in time. Helicopters cannot reach that height, and no climbers nearby could assist without putting their own lives at risk. With no other option, Marek unclipped from the waiting point and began the descent. He went down alone. Marek reached Camp 4 alone in the early hours of the descent. By the time he arrived, his oxygen supply was nearly exhausted, but he was still able to walk and speak clearly. He informed the expedition leader right away that his son had not responded at the waiting point and that staying any longer would have put his own life at risk. The team reviewed what they could immediately. Oxygen usage was checked. Tomasz's equipment was examined, using the information Marek provided about its condition. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The system had been working. There was no sign of gear failure. A brief discussion took place about whether a recovery might be possible, but it ended quickly. At that height, with worsening weather and other climbers still moving on the route, sending people back up would have created more casualties. Tomasz's body was left where it was. Later that day, the death was reported to Nepalese authorities through standard expedition procedures. Tomasz Nowak was officially recorded as having died at an altitude above 27,800 feet on the southeast ridge route of Mount Everest. No recovery attempt was approved. The location, exposure, and physical demands of working at that elevation made retrieval unsafe. After the expedition ended, a formal review was conducted with the outfitting company and the local authorities. The findings were consistent across all reports. Tomasz's cause of death was listed as hypothermia, with lack of oxygen contributing. There was no evidence of a fall or injury. The oxygen system was functioning correctly. No expedition rules had been broken. The review noted that separating briefly near the summit did not violate common high-altitude practices. However, it also emphasized a critical point. Remaining above 27,000 feet is extremely dangerous, even with bottled oxygen. The risk is often underestimated because the decline happens quietly, without obvious warning signs. The incident was recorded as a fatal exposure, not an accident and not abandonment. No penalties were issued, and no new rules were introduced. On Everest, nothing dramatic failed. The weather held, the equipment worked. What ran out was the body's ability to recover once it stopped moving. The expedition ended less than 2 days later. As weather conditions began to worsen, remaining climbers were told to descend, and the summit window closed. Tomasz's body remained attached to the fixed rope near where he had been left. At that altitude, it would likely stay there, gradually covered by snow and slowly carried by the movement of ice over time. In the weeks that followed, the outfitting company completed its review of the incident. Medical consultants agreed on the cause of death: hypothermia, made worse by lack of oxygen. There was no sign of a fall, no injuries, and no outside force involved. Equipment records showed that the oxygen system had worked normally. The mask and regulator were functioning as they should. The review found that Marek's decision to separate from his son did not break expedition rules or standard practices used on Everest. Climbers often make similar choices near the summit when time and oxygen are limited. What the report focused on instead was the danger of remaining still at extreme altitude. Above 27,000 feet, even short periods without movement can push the body past the point where it can recover, regardless of fitness or experience. That detail became the defining factor of the case. Tomasz had not fallen. He had not made a reckless move. He had waited. Thank you for watching. Click here for more videos.